A few years ago, I was doing a training on basic principles of graphic design for college faculty, and I realized that with just some really basic design concepts, they could go from something like this to something like this. In other words, they could dramatically improve how something looks, but also how it functions and how it communicates information to others. It got me thinking about how we approach teaching folks about accessibility and universal design for learning. Now, I've seen sessions that were focused really heavily on the law, as an example, and that seems to be a troublesome approach because when you start the conversation by saying, if you don't do this, there might be a legal punishment, then I think that creates a combative relationship between the instructors who are designing the course and the students on the other side. I've also tried sessions with more interactive pieces where we would try and simulate different impairments, but it ultimately felt like we were playing disabled, and I didn't really like that feeling. So now I want to take a slightly different approach. I think that a lot of the accessibility challenges that we see, a lot of the UDL challenges that we see in courses could actually be solved through the use of some basic design principles. And if you think about how we communicate with others on a regular basis and how we communicate in our courses, there are certainly things like texting, chat, webinars, but also those passive things like websites and documents and presentations that we create for others. I think applying some basic principles of graphic design could help us A, significantly improve the quality of those documents and experiences, but also make them significantly more accessible to other learners. One helpful starting point is just remembering that our personal abilities really do define our sense of what is normal, and building on that, it's really easy to overlook people who are outside of our zone of normal. One famous example that I've seen of this was a disabilities rights advocate who was asked to come and speak at a Smart Cities panel to talk about how cities of the future could be made more accessible for those with mobile impairments. And it turns out they did not think to include a ramp for the stage, so he literally had to be lifted onto the stage. A bit ironic, but also in a really sad way. And this unfortunately happens to countless learners in countless contexts every single day. Another challenge, if you are a relatively able-bodied person who lives your life without any major or notable impairments, is that we disproportionately tend to focus on visible impairments, the things that we can immediately see. This is not too surprising in the grand scheme of things. There was a study about this back in the 80s, and this will be a dramatic oversimplification of this study, but basically what they did was they took a bunch of physics problems and they gave them to physics students and physics professors, and they said, go ahead and sort these however you think they should be sorted. Now, the physics students looked at the problems and they said, oh, there's a box on a slope, so all the problems with boxes on slopes must belong together. In other words, the learners who are brand new to this information grouped the problems based off of the superficial, immediately observable characteristics. The physics professors, on the other hand, grouped the same problems based off of the formula that you would need to use to solve it. Now, this makes sense in the grand scheme of things. If you don't have very much information, you have to go off of what you can immediately see. If you have a lot of information, you have deeper underlying neural networks of understanding that give you a more sophisticated view of the situation. So if this is something that you're relatively new to or something that you're just now starting to pay more attention to, A, good for you, but B, keep in mind that we do disproportionately focus on visible impairments. In fact, the universal sign for accessibility is a person in a wheelchair. And physical impairments are typically obvious, they're immediately observable, but a lot of impairments are relatively invisible because they're either well treated or they're a little bit more situational. Like it would be difficult to look at someone and tell if they're living with IBS. And this holds true to the larger community of folks living with disabilities out there. Only about 7% of all disabilities have some sort of physical component that would make them immediately observable. That means that we're leaving out about 93% of the folks in the disabled community. Now, when it comes to learning materials, we tend to focus on the two most common impairments that we think are out there, which are hearing impairments and sight impairments. We certainly should focus on those sorts of impairments, especially when we're creating digital media for learners to consume. But it turns out making the content accessible for the blind and visually impaired or the hearing disabled or deaf is actually relatively simple. We know what to do, it just takes a little bit of extra time. What's a little bit more challenging is designing our course so that all members of the disabled community can equally participate and have equal access to course information without an impairment. So what I want to do in these videos is shed light on the 93% of other disabilities out there that are really easy to overlook because they're functionally invisible or well treated. My guess is most of you are coming to us from the world of education, and I want to temporarily talk about disability statistics within the world of higher education. Due to federal laws and reporting requirements, as well as accreditation requirements, there's actually a tremendous amount of data from the world of higher education to let us know how many college students, as an example, if we're using them as a representative sample, happen to have a registered impairment with their school's Disabilities or Accessibility Resources Office. And it turns out that number is about 1 in 5, so about 20% of all students in higher education have a registered disability or impairment with their Office of Accessibility Resources or Disability Resources at their college or university. We also know from these statistics that these students also have what is called significant comorbidity. And what that means is very often if they are living with one type of impairment, the most popular being mental or emotional or learning impairments, they're very often living with a second impairment that either amplifies the original or can really wreak havoc on their life and create a lot of challenges for them day to day. So, for example, someone living with a generalized anxiety disorder is also very likely to be suffering from depression or to experience bouts of depression from time to time. We also know that, sticking with anxiety as a theme, another common comorbidity is ADHD. So folks living with anxiety very often have ADHD. Folks living with ADHD very often also have anxiety. And it's very easy to overlook this, but this is where a tremendous amount of our learners happen to live. It can be challenging enough to live with just one of these conditions, but it becomes even harder when they're combined with others. And these are just the diagnosed and registered cases based off of this data. So if we were to start by focusing on, let's say, 2 common invisible impairments, let's focus on depression and anxiety, since those are very common registered impairments in higher education. What we found is that 64% of all students, not just the ones who are registered, but 64% of all students have reported feeling overwhelming anxiety within the past year. This was the gender breakdown. They didn't ask for gender on a spectrum. It was just a binary choice. So half of the male respondents and 75% of the female respondents said that they felt overwhelming anxiety within the past year. Now, to take this a step further, one of the design resources that I use is a stock photo site called Pexels.com, so Pexels.com. I looked for the word depression on there, and I got pretty much everything that you would expect. A lot of loneliness, a lot of people kind of looking away from the camera, or just looking kind of sad and forlorn. But here's the thing. Depression can also look like this. People living with depression or anxiety, learning disabilities, chronic health issues, they are not incapable of experiencing joy or happiness or other positive emotions. It's just that the conditions that they're living with are not immediately observable, either because they're well treated or because those learners have done such a good job learning how to mask their impairments from others for fear of judgment. So in the rest of these videos, we're going to talk about how do we design for things that we can't see. So please stick around.